So my name is Sandy O'Leary. I'm head of the risk advisory function at calQrisk. Today, we're going to have a look at the topic of outsourcing risk, which, as we all know, is a pretty hot topic across the movement and has been for quite some time. I suppose just to give a general background, you're all familiar with calQrisk, so they're just the details of the organization as such and our experience in this particular sector. Personally speaking, as I suppose relatively new to the staff at calQrisk, I just wanted to give a general idea of my own background for those of you that I don't already know, which there are many thankfully on this session that I do know. I've had more than 15 years experience working with community and industrial credit unions across the sector, and plenty of qualifications from the various colleges around this topic and others. I suppose the thing I do bring to it is a lot of practical experience, both in terms of having delivered training and risk and compliance topics to credit union professionals across many institutions at this stage, and also on a one-to-one basis. I suppose the key point being I've plenty of actual experience in successfully embedding risk management across operations and governance in credit unions over the last few years. So hopefully I bring that to bear with a lot of these types of topics and sessions where we try to actually make things a little bit more practical and hopefully help from a purely, putting things into practice rather than purely theoretical. So today, what we're going to cover is the topic of developing a strong outsourcing risk management framework. Throughout today, if you have questions, please do drop them into the chat. If I don't spot it, because I get engrossed in something that I'm saying, I will come back to it towards the end and will address any questions that haven't been covered. The session is being recorded, so just to remind you that that is the case. I suppose from a purely, to focus the mind right from the get-go, there are two things that I think are really important in terms of developing a strong outsourcing risk management framework, and that is to understand the credit union's own exposure to outsourcing risk. And it is important not to bury our heads in the sand and just kind of try not to think about it, try not to worry about it. It's there, it has to be managed, and the earlier we get to grips with the extent of it, easier it will be then to manage that risk. And hopefully by developing, a documented framework, it's a lot clearer what needs to be managed, when, and by whom. So that's, I suppose, key to the embedding of, strong risk management in any activity, but particularly in this one, which can seem kind of harder to control purely by virtue of the fact that we're actually outsourcing a lot of, or at least the activities that we're actually talking about within that framework. So that's the purpose of today. We're going to address this throughout. What I'm going to start with really is just for anyone who might be relatively new to this area, outsourcing really is just the practice of hiring any external company or service to provide or to perform an activity or service on the credit union's behalf. And this can be recurring, as in intermittent, or it can be on a constant or ongoing basis. So it will very much depend on the activity as to what the delivery mechanism might be, in terms of whether it's somebody you engage once a year to do a particular activity, or whether it's somebody you engage monthly or literally 24/7. It is very important, and this is one of the key things to stress, that the credit union remains responsible for the outsourced activity and service. And by virtue of literally taking on another company or engaging another professional to deliver it, does not mean that the credit union has removed all risk from its remit. On top of that, then you also add in the outsourcing risk itself. So there's the activity and the risk that might be associated with a particular activity, but then you do bring in an added level of outsourcing risk. Bear in mind, and as you will all be very familiar with, the credit union cannot outsource any core competencies that it has for the running of its business, or any function that is part of the board of directors. So the caveats in relation to outsourcing, generally speaking. In terms of the benefits, then, why would you bother? Why would you even think about outsourcing? The whole point of it is to meet the challenge of technological innovation sometimes. It can be to increase, it's a response to increased specialization across the market for different activities, services that the credit union engages in. It can be about cost control. To a large extent, this one needs to be analyzed carefully before you make any decision, because there are going to be pros and cons around the cost elements of it, depending on the activity that we're talking about in the first place. There is a response, it could be a response to heightened competition in the market, and it can allow credit unions to concentrate on its own core activities. And these are benefits that are desirable. These are ones that we would all aim to achieve, all of them if possible. Some of them might be more applicable than others, depending on the activity that we're talking about at a given time. But all of these are good reasons and should form the basis for a documented rationale as to why you're even considering outsourcing in the first place. And it'll help to frame that discussion if you are trying to make a case for outsourcing in one shape or another. Though, as I mentioned, by outsourcing any activity or service, you're introducing a different layer, another layer of risk. And that outsourcing risk is basically all the risks associated with simply outsourcing any activity or service. And these includes, whether the chosen outsource service provider is suitable or not. And that's down to the credit union to make a determination on. Will it reduce the credit union's control over that activity or service? And will that then have the possibility of impacting on the quality of service that you offer to your members? That's an important one to consider. It could include limited access to relevant information. So sometimes, for all of the reasons we just mentioned around specialization and so on and so forth, we engage third parties with expertise to help us to deliver a product or service. But it can also mean that by having outsourced that, we have less access to the information we might need to make business-related decisions or to make informed decisions as to the performance of the outsourced service provider. So the limited access to information really needs to be addressed kind of upfront, in the sense that the credit union maybe makes a very early determination as to what type of information they want on an ongoing basis to allow them both to monitor the activity and service, and also to monitor the performance of the outsourced service party themselves. When you outsource, there's always an increased potential for legal issues, because you've got another business, you have another professional, you have another agency involved. So therefore, the potential has increased for legal issues to impact on the credit union. There's an increased potential for data privacy issues for the same reasons. You're simply adding another layer of complication and possibly have additional places where data will reside that you need to be aware of and be able to maintain responsibility for to an extent. Obviously, that depends again on the service and the contractual arrangements that are in place around the particular outsourced activity. You also have the potential for an uncontrolled escalation in costs. So you may be making a decision very much based on your initial assessment of what the cost benefits would be, but outsourcing risk can include a potential for hidden costs to materialize that maybe you weren't aware of when you engaged in the outsourcing or the decision to outsource in the first place. And then there's always the risk of scope creep, whereby the activity that you engaged the service provider to deliver in the first place gets bigger and bigger over time. In a lot of cases, validly, in the sense that you get more experience and maybe trust with the company that you're working with, but sometimes it can happen and you don't notice it happening. And that's very important for a number of reasons, and we'll mention that later on in the session. So in terms of the framework itself, what I'm trying to do is I suppose, break it down into an organized, logical process that will facilitate that embeddedness, and it will facilitate the decisions and the activities that happen in the credit union around outsourcing. So for me, the outsourcing framework consists of 8 potential sections, 7 at least, but maybe 8. First one is the decision-making process. So it's important that you go through that in a logical way. Second one is the kind of one that can be variable. sometimes it may involve a decision to move an activity that is currently in-house outside to and outsource it. That may or may not be part of every outsourcing decision-making process or framework. Then you have the selection process itself. You've the due diligence, the legal agreements part, the performance management side, and then the OSP risk management element. And finally, in an event that you might have to exit an outsourcing arrangement. So, and in that case, you may be starting all over again, hence the cyclical image. So for me, that kind of sums up, I guess, all the key elements to an outsourcing framework, that if you have these in place, you can break down and assign maybe responsibility or authority around the different elements of it. So the first one then is the decision-making process. This is vital for demonstrating, I guess, risk management embeddedness in any decision-making process, but most, very importantly in the outsourcing one, because it is such an important decision for an organization to be making. The first thing to do is to document your assessment of the activity or the service or process that you're considering outsourcing. And that in itself is a really good exercise, in the sense that you will get a feel for the extent of what you hope to achieve by the outsourcing, and possibly also set limits on it. And that'll help you in making the decision initially, and then also in engaging and going out to the market to find a suitable outsourced service provider. There should be a cost-benefit analysis. That goes without saying, it sounds like, but oftentimes, unless you sit down literally and start from point A and work through to point Z, you may miss pieces here and there. And that's where sometimes these costs then come back to bite us later. What we thought maybe would be a no-brainer in terms of outsourcing for cost benefit, for cost gains, doesn't materialize. And that can be challenging. So it's important to work that out at the beginning and be as critical as you can be at that stage. In terms of criticality, again, if pardon the pun at that stage, establish what level of criticality this particular outsource or this particular activity has for your own business. And that's it again, it's very good to establish this early, because an awful lot of the outsourcing process, a lot of what you will do or not do, will be determined by the level of criticality that you determine for your business. And it is good to have maybe just those criteria. What is critical for you? What's important for you in your outsourcing policy that you can refer to? And then, depending on where this particular activity falls, will determine how complex or not the outsourcing process itself will need to be. But at least you'll have made that decision early on in the process. You also need to consider where there might be a data privacy implication. Is your business data involved for a start? Is there personal data involved? Could there be sensitive personal data? All of these things will be important to determine from the beginning, to figure out what level of complexity might be involved at that, in terms of the early stages of an outsourcing arrangement. So based on all of those, it's good to prepare a business case for your proposal and ensure the proposal is aligned with the credit union's strategic plan. A lot of these activities, and I would imagine all of them more often than not, should be considered and planned in the context of the strategic plan, so that you can confirm that you are moving towards achieving the plan in one way or another, or that it is not actually going to hinder you from achieving the strategic plan. So it's always good to put it in that context, and then seek approval from your appropriate internal authorities. That will be determined by your level of criticality and the cost and so on of those earlier points, as to who is the appropriate person within the credit union to give the go-ahead to do it. And this would be at the proposal stage. So part 2 in the cycle is the moving from in-house to outsourcing. And you won't always have this decision to make. Many credit unions will have outsourced certain activities since the year dot. But in some situations, you may be looking at an in-house activity that is proving, for a whole variety of reasons, to be challenging to deliver in-house, and you may decide to make an outsourcing decision. So the key there is to consider all your options before you make a final decision. Weigh up the cost differences between both the financial elements and what might be a loss of internal knowledge or expertise. And it's important to get that balance right. Oftentimes it's not all about the finances, and other times there can be, the weighting will change depending on the situation that a credit union's in at a particular point in time, because that can change over time. If you are making the decision to move from in-house to outsourcing, develop a human resource plan if necessary. So you may have somebody that's already doing that activity or had been trained up in that activity when the outsourcing decision is being made. So make sure you know what you're going to do with the resource that was earmarked for that or already performing that function. If that type of change is going to happen, make sure that you prepare a communications plan to keep the relevant officers informed. And that is the people who are either undertaking the activity or have been for some time. It might be a good thing. They might have been dying for not to have to do this activity anymore. On the other hand, it may require retraining for them. They may need to focus on, or at least have a decision or have some time made to consider what their future is going to look like. So it's really important to include any HR implications in your business case proposals. If there are any, there may not be, but if there are, it's important to consider it and build that into your decision-making process and document it in your business case if you can. Step then is the outsourced service provider selection process itself. So you will have a lot of, I guess, the outline of this in your outsourcing policy more than likely. That will give you an idea from the get-go of what the approval process you will need to undertake. And that will be very much linked to the scale and complexity of the activity that you're talking about outsourcing. Some will be fairly simple, minor outsourcing arrangements that are well within the operational context. Cost is not particularly significant, and potentially, that they'll change throughout periods of time in terms of better service or better costings and so on. On the other hand, you can also have ones that are much larger decisions, both in terms of the scale, potential impact on the business, and complexity in terms of how it maybe works with or engages with other activities and other services that the credit union is performing. So the procurement procedure whatever procurement procedure you have in place, will likely have different practices depending on the scale and complexity of the outsourcing activity itself. So at this stage, you decide which one you need to adopt, and then you decide whether you're going to maybe appoint a project manager or an implementation team. If it's a very complex activity that requires specialist knowledge or just requires the time and attention of somebody who understands what's going on in relation to that activity, it could be a major saving in terms of both stress, not to mention the actual success of the implementation process itself. So that will be very much determined on a case-by-case basis as to what the activity involves or the service involves. You then go through the agreeing of a tender, quotation, evaluation criteria, if that's appropriate, again, depending on the scale and complexity of the service you're considering. And once you've agreed what those criteria will be, the next step obviously is then to evaluate the tenders as part of that selection process. And once you've got all of that data together and proposed to the appropriate internal authority, again, depending on the scale and complexity as to whether that might be the CEO or the board or whomever, that the appropriate internal authority is given or gives the green light for it to go ahead. So at that stage, depending again on the materiality of the service or the criticality of the service for the credit union, there's a range of due diligence options for the credit union. And again, some of these will be applicable in certain situations, all of them in other situations. You've got things like industry references. So that would be the same as you would if you were buying or any product or service that you're going to be engaging in or you're going to be investing in from a business perspective. Look at your media checks, see what the reputation of that company or professional might be in the market. Financial health checks, these can be difficult enough to do, but there are ways and means, both Companies Registration Office, like Stubbs Gazette and so on, other providers, where you can do, a fairly good review, and you'll be able to make a determination as to the financial health of the company. Regulatory compliance checks. So again, if they require regulatory approval, make sure that they have that approval in place and that there are no queries around that. Now, obviously, there's limited ability to check that type of information. And unfortunately, that tends to be great to have with hindsight. You don't know if there's issues that aren't in the public domain. But as far as possible, it's about making sure that you do those checks within the realms of reasonableness and reality. Insurance coverage, if the company that you're hiring need to have insurance coverage, and that can be professional coverage as well, like professional indemnity insurance. So it's important to make sure that they have the cover that they should have. Confirmation of business continuity and operational resilience arrangements. I mean, that's absolutely vital for any outsourced arrangement, to confirm what their business continuity, not necessarily that they'll give you the full detail of what their business continuity plan is, because that could have sensitive information as regards the business in it, but confirmation that it is in place and how regularly they test them and so on and so forth. It's really important for your own peace of mind as a credit union. Things like conflict of interest status check and regulatory notifications. These are important just to, again, make sure that you've covered all the key areas. The next area is the outsourcing agreements. This is one that more often than not you may need additional advice or guidance in relation to the review of the contracts, the service level agreements. I mean, over the years, I've seen everything from a simple 2-pager through to 200 pages of legal wording. And depending on the scale of the arrangement and how critical it is and how important it might be to be able to rely on certain clauses of your contract or service level agreement, then you may need independent legal advice in certain situations. But it's important to make sure that you have, I suppose, assured yourself, either through reading them yourselves or through getting that and/or the independent legal advice, that you know what you're getting into and that you can hold them to account. If there is personal data involved, you may need to review a data processor agreement. The same caveats would apply. If you need help and guidance, then get it. Better to have that right from the beginning and then be confident of your arrangements than looking back on it later and thinking, oh gosh, I should have done that. And maybe if I had got some independent advice, it might not have gotten to where it got to. Another element which can come up occasionally, depending on particularly if it's a software service that you're engaging with, to confirm that there's an escrow agreement in place. And for those of you who wouldn't be familiar with this area, escrow agreement basically is a contract which guarantees that the credit union will have access to the software source code under specified conditions. And those specified conditions would be things like if the supplier were to become bankrupt or insolvent. So again, it's a kind of a worst case scenario, but the good thing is that it means that if anything were to go significantly wrong with a service provider in terms of software, you will be able to continue to use the software and manage your exit and manage your new engagement of a new outsource provider in a controlled manner. So the next Part 6 is the outsourced service provider performance management piece. And I cannot stress this one enough in terms of managing the credit union's own exposure around outsourcing and outsourcing risk itself. It's really important that you maintain a detailed register of your outsourced service providers. And that includes an indicator of how material they might be in terms of the service that they're providing to the credit union. So your criticality hierarchy, critical, non-critical, you can have 2, 3, it's up to you how you tier them. But that will determine then the level of performance monitoring that you might be wanting to attach to the various providers. It allows you then to assign ownership of performance monitoring And again, I think this is really important. Sometimes they kind of fall between stools, depending on both the users of the service and the ones who are important, who are maybe monitoring the value for money that you're getting from the service and so on. So make sure that somebody in the credit union is aware that they're the ones whose opinion really counts when it comes to renewing the contract, for example. So ownership of that performance monitoring piece is important. Establish where there are relevant monitoring criteria, so what key performance indicators for each critical outsourced service provider. And you'll find those predominantly part of the early assessment of the risk of the activity itself that you're about to outsource, or it can be also in the service level agreement. You will have KPIs in there, and you'll be able to pull together for the risk owner a list of the critical items that you want to monitor. Again, from a performance management perspective, it's important to keep an eye on the financial health of the outsourced service provider, again, as far as is reasonable. Provide regular management information to the board to support the board's annual review, because as you know, they have an obligation to review the critical outsourced service providers. So unless they're getting information as regards their performance, then obviously it will be very challenging to review it. So that can be maybe regular as part of a monthly or quarterly report, depending on what the activity is. And it can just be built into a standard board report, a section on the key service provider in that particular activity or area. I'm all for streamlining these things as much as possible. Make them as part of the business as usual of an activity as much as you can, because then there's far less likelihood that it'll be forgotten, and then you come to the board, to the performance review section, you're going to go, gee, we meant to kind of keep that going over the year and we forgot. So if you can build it into a routine activity, were there any good things that happened this month or performance that you want to bring to their attention, because we tend to forget about them over time because the significance fades. Keep internal audit updated of any new OSPs for their internal audit plan if necessary, because it may be something that they need to keep an eye on as part of an activity that they are responsible for auditing. Inform the compliance function as well, because that could have an impact on the compliance plan in the year. If they want to keep in the role as compliance officer, it's important to keep an eye if it's a regulated activity, for example, or if it's one that could impact on the credit union's own compliance requirements. Inform the risk management function for the risk management program for all the same reasons. So, there's plenty of information, or at least there's plenty of people that can help monitor and manage the performance of the outsourced service providers once they're aware and once they know what it is that they need to be keeping an eye out for. So in terms of the risk management piece, specifically, notify the regulator of the appointment of or change of a critical outsourced service provider. I should have said critical outsourced service provider there, because obviously you don't need to notify the regulator of every outsourcing arrangement. Review the associated risks. So depending on the activity that's being outsourced, have a look, and particularly if you're going maybe from in-house to outsourcing, make sure that the management of individual risks that are affected hasn't changed. And it could be that it's improved, it could be over time that it's not, and that you find that the risk is not being managed as well as you'd like. So it gives you a structure to look at it and analyze it. Update your risk mitigation plan regularly. So if the outsourcing arrangement was brought in potentially to mitigate a certain set of risks, then make sure that that is noted in the plan, and then over time as to whether it was effective or not. Similar to what I mentioned earlier, ensure that the 3 lines of defense are active in relation to each critical outsourced service provider. And that does come back to the communication piece from the get-go in terms of informing the different elements, the different functions that perform those lines of defense, whether it's front of house in terms of the people who are at the coalface of delivering the activity or service, or engaging with members who are the ones that are that are engaging with the activity. So, it's important to get that feedback and build it into the 3 lines of defense so that we can start to track if anything is going a little bit awry. Ensure that the credit union's business continuity and operational resilience frameworks reflect the correct set of outsourced service providers on an ongoing basis. And that is important because, even if they're relatively, let's say, minor or non-critical outsourced service providers, they're still providing a service, if you pardon the expression or the repetition. And if anything were to happen, we want everybody who needs to know to be able to deal with any interruption to service or be part of the solution to getting the service back up and running. So it is important for all your business continuity and operational resilience exercises, procedures, and so on and so forth to make sure that the list of outsourced service providers is as up to date as it can possibly be. And, very importantly, the contact details for them so that if they were needed, that information is available and it's there. You won't be contacting them all right from, the outset, but over time you may need to complete the full list. So in terms of the cycle, you then have the exiting of an outsourcing arrangement. So for that, it's obviously important, if we can, to keep a list of alternates that might be available in the market. It's not, particularly in credit union world, there aren't, in some areas, there aren't a huge number of choices. But the important thing is to be aware of them if they are, and to at least know that they exist and how you would make contact with them if you needed to start to look for an alternate at some point. It's important to keep that list as up to date as you can. Check the service level agreement and contract for an exit clause and for the specific terms of the exit clause in each individual arrangement if you're considering exiting an arrangement, because they do vary from contract to contract. It's important to determine right from the get-go if there's going to be any financial penalties for exiting the contract. A lot there will depend on the circumstances involved in the exiting of the arrangement and at whose instigation this is happening. But at least if you know what the financial penalties are, you'll know whether you're either willing to pay for it or you're going to work through the notice period. You'll make an informed decision at that stage. Confirm the exit notification period requirement from the SLA or the contract as well. They also vary, and it's important to keep a track of that in your OSP register to make sure so that if you are, even at a contract renewal stage, there's no point in deciding that you're not going to renew the contract if you need to give 6 months notice and, the contract ends in a month. Will the activity be brought in-house or transferred to another outsourced service provider? So that will obviously determine to a large extent the complexity of the exiting arrangement as well. Ask the relevant questions such as, is data migration going to be involved? Will a parallel run period be required? And all of these things will impact on the timing of the exiting arrangement. It's important in some instances to be aware, well, it's always important to be aware of it, but in some instances, it's important to notify other impacted stakeholders. And stakeholders can be anything from the members who are availing of the service, through the credit union officers who use the service provider functionality or service, through to the regulator themselves, through to auditors, through to other technology that integrates with the service that you're considering changing or eliminating. So each particular activity will have a different set of stakeholders, and it's important to always, know who they are in the first place, and then notify the relevant parties when a change is being considered. So in a critical service situation, it's really important that you notify the regulator of a change to a critical service. So even if you are changing provider, you need to notify your regulator that that's your plan. So to summarize, I guess, everything that I've just been saying, whether there's only a few or there are loads of service providers in a particular activity or area, a comprehensive outsourcing framework is really vital to have, to be aware of how exposed your own business is to outsourcing as a heading, or to its individual outsourced service providers. Now, that can be both in terms of the individual provider itself, but it can also be about the number of activities, the number of key business activities that are maybe outsourced to a single provider, and then how much as a proportion of your business is allocated to outsource service providers collectively. So it's about learning. It's about knowing your susceptibility, knowing your exposure, and managing that. If you don't know about it, it's impossible to manage it. At least if you know about it, you know what mitigations you can put in place around it. And you often hear, well, what's the point in worrying about it? We've only got one choice anyway, or we've only got two choices. The fewer the outsourced service provider options, the more important certain aspects of the framework will become. So strong contracts, the existence of your escrow agreements, operational resilience and business continuity, they're all even more important if there's only a few outsourced service provider options in that area. So it doesn't matter, to some extent, it doesn't matter how many choices there are, your outsourcing framework is really going to form a key element to the management of the activity itself and the outsourcing risk that's associated with it. So I guess in conclusion, I would say that good outsourcing risk management will hopefully, the whole plan behind it is to reduce the likelihood of an unpleasant surprise. We don't want them ever, but at least if you're keeping an eye on it, and if you're monitoring both who you're outsourcing to and the activity itself, early detection can be a huge difference between a smooth and easy recovery, transition to a new service provider if necessary, or just improving or restoring the level of service that you want or anticipated with the least amount of disruption. And the alternative is it can be a very painful experience if you're kind of not keeping an eye on it, if you are not monitoring and making sure that the credit union is getting what it expects from its outsourced service provider arrangements. So I haven't seen any questions in the chat. That's kind of covered all the key areas that I had intended to cover. Basically, it's up to yourselves if you've got any questions you'd like me to address in relation to anything that's come up on the presentation. Okay, Janet, can you should be able to unmute yourself, I think, she said confidently. Reading. Okay, Janet, you put your hand up first. I think you can unmute yourself.
Yes, I don't have a question, but my chat is saying that the chat is disabled in case anyone else was trying to put a message in.
Oh, apologies. I wonder, because I assumed that was working. That is very poor of me to assume anything, isn't it? Yeah, apologies, Janet. Yeah, if anybody would like to just put your hand up and I can unmute you. And okay, I don't see any hands up or and it's probably, I didn't set up the Zoom myself, so I'm not sure if I can chat settings. Okay. Oh, Joe, I see you have your hand up there. You can unmute yourself now.
It's just a kind of a definition of what's the difference between critical providers as against the others for regulatory notification.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is the one that actually challenges, let me just go right back to it is the one that I think that challenges most, to be honest. And I think there's a lot of different ways you can kind of think about it. Right from the outset, I guess one of the most material things would be whether it requires regulatory authorization or not. And so whether that's the ROI regulatory authorization process or the NI threshold conditions. So there are other regulatory requirements obviously as well, but that would be the key one in terms of criticality for me. Then you ask questions like what would it impact in terms of the orderly running of the credit union? How much control are you basically passing over to another company or set of professionals? That would be quite important for your own business, and to make sure that if they weren't performing properly, would it impact on your ability to perform properly? If you're outsourcing an entire function, for example, whether it's IT, whether it's the banking software, whatever it is, that obviously is critical to you delivering a service to your members. Whether it will impact the control effectiveness. So when we talk about risk management and we talk about controls, putting controls in place to manage risk, if the outsourcing arrangement is going to impact on your ability to control or manage the risks associated with that activity, then that will impact on criticality. Whether, for example, it will allow, whether your ability to monitor and manage all the associated risks in relation to that activity, that's important in terms of making a determination around that area as well. And I suppose one of the obvious things in terms of assessing it is kind of going to be the cost to the business, both in terms of the outsourcing activity itself, and also if it were to go wrong, how much it would cost the credit union. And I guess that impacts on decisions around financial stability, the credit union's own financial performance, whether it can afford it or not. The arrangements, for example, the cost that might be involved in developing the resilience response. Because, operational resilience, as you all know, is another hot topic. And if you've got to be able to maintain your business through a disruptive event, for example, that's going to cost, and the timing of those. So that all has an impact in how critical the service might consider to be. And then that also obviously has a knock-on effect in terms of the actual credit union's own business continuity and operational resilience in terms of providing assurance to the regulator of its ability to run its business. I suppose the other thing in terms of criticality is the capability of the credit union to get back into that activity if they needed to, either themselves or the ability to put another third party in its place to continue to resolve an issue that may have arisen. Does that help, Joe? Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it sort of gives you an indication as to what you have to consider, I suppose. Yeah, because obviously there's small providers that
exactly. It's always going to be
that you don't actually have to go through the same process.
Exactly. That's it, exactly. And that's why, it's important that it will be, I suppose, part of the decision-making process from the beginning. What is the area that, what level of criticality is there in the first place? And that will then determine how complex your outsourcing process either needs to be, and then how complex your monitoring and performance management needs to be. So we don't want to waste time on stuff that's non-critical, but you need to make the decision as to which it is, and then make sure that you're aware.
That's great, Sandy. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Anyone else have any questions? If you want to put your hand up, I can unmute you. Okay, hopefully I gave everybody as much information as you need to kind of maybe pad out sounds terrible, expand your outsourcing risk framework and get it to the point where it's helping you to understand the risks that are facing you, and to help you to manage the outsourcing risk going forward. If you have any further questions at any stage, you know where we are in terms of calQrisk. You have all the details of how to contact us at any stage. If there's anything that you need, I see. Thank you, comment there. There's multiple ways to get to us, so please feel free at any stage to make contact. If there's anything, a follow-up question or query that you have on this, we'd be more than happy to help. So I hope you all have a good week and enjoy the rest of your day, and hopefully you've got a bit of use out of this morning's session.
Thank you.
Thank you for the feedback, everyone.